we're looking forward to your presentation.
So I'm just going to go ahead. Hi from me as well. Thanks for joining, and let's just dive straight in. Are you all able to see everything? Is that fine?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So in 1556, the following small booklet containing one song was printed in the city of Bern. Sorry. There you go. A pretty new song and true story, How Free the Bear, which should represent the city of Bern. How Free the Bear has set aright the war that was between Geneva and Savoy, which their bishop had arranged. Alone against the word of God, from which followed much murder. Still the word of God remained, and the bishop was evicted. In that way, God can impede foul attacks and practice revenge on his enemies. Wie wohl ich bin ein alter Gries, although I am an old man, that is this song's true melody. Also, it is sung in the line of the Murtenlied, the song of the city of Murten, where another duke died in this manner. The song recounts the story of the intervention of the city of Bern in a conflict between its ally, the city of Geneva, with the Duke of Savoy in 1536. The intervention led to the annexation of big parts of the Savoyard territory around Lake Geneva by Bernese troops. What is particularly interesting about this pamphlet, though, is the fact that it makes reference to two already existing songs to indicate the tune in which it should be sung. This was a very common thing in medieval and early modern popular song. Instead of providing a melody in notation, most songs of this kind recycled the melody of already existing songs that the intended audience would very likely have been familiar with. This practice, which is usually referred to as contrafactum, had a twofold purpose. On one hand, using a well-known catchy melody facilitated memorizing of a new song by a broader public. On the other hand, it could also be used to create implicit and explicit references to topics that were previously associated with the given melody. By using a particular melody for a new song, the composer could sort of tap into the listener's or singer's repertoire of associations, playing with his or her expectations, and thus create a whole new layer of meaning. In our example, the Song of Murten refers to one of the successful battles the Bernese fought in their war against the expansionist Duke of Burgundy some 80 years prior to the publication of this song. By quite literally invoking these events, the song about the conflict of 1536 unmistakably alludes to the city of Bern's self-image as the power and the protector of proper geopolitical order, and to its successful history of taking down overly confident dukes. It is exactly this aspect of creating implicit or explicit links between different songs and their texts that makes the practice of contrafactum such an interesting subject of study. While some impressive work has been done by studying different examples of such songs and retracing their connections to earlier ones, I would argue that network analysis and visualization might help us gain a better overview, as well as open up new possibilities of analysis of this phenomenon. In this presentation, I would like to share some of my conceptual reflections on how to move from the raw source material to a network, and also ponder some possibilities of analysis and interpretation of such a network. These reflections are part of my dissertation on Swiss political songs of the 16th century, and also my first moves into the direction of network analysis, and very much a work in progress. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion later on and to hearing your inputs. At first glance, getting from the raw material of printed song booklets to a network of notes and etches may seem pretty straightforward. One could assume that, much like in the network of modern day citations, what we are looking at are printed objects that somehow refer to other printed objects. The connecting element here would be the reference given on the title page of the print, in the way that we have seen in the introduction. However, on closer look, it becomes evident that the relationships that are established through contrafactum are slightly more abstract than this. what the prints refer to are not in fact other tangible prints, but just titles or first lines of songs. To shed some more light on this, it may help to first draw a clear distinction between three different levels of analysis: prints, songs, and melodies. At the bottom layer, we have our source material, the prints. They have been printed at a specific point in time by a specific person in a specific place. However, it is possible that there are several prints that are virtually identical in that they represent the same text with only minor or sometimes even major changes. The printed pamphlet shown at the beginning of the presentation, for example, has been reprinted at least 2 times during the 16th century, but remained, apart from a few minor changes in typesetting, mostly unchanged. It can therefore help to think of prints as individual manifestations of a more abstract text, or what we could call a song in our model here. The song in turn is tightly connected to a purely musical melody, of which, however, we usually have no trace at all, apart from a few very lucky exceptions that are actually have survived in notation. It is of course also these songs that the prints refer to, rather than other prints, as we have mentioned before, or the purely musical melody. A song that is referred to could potentially be printed once, or be reprinted several times, or in fact just be part of a collective intangible repertoire of songs that never was written down or printed at all. When we come back now to thinking about our notes and etches, it becomes clear that the relationship established through contrafactum is located on the level of these songs, i.e. on the level of an abstract text that is linked to another abstract text. The evidence for this link, however, can only be found on the level of the printed manifestation of the song. From this follows that the reference between songs could actually vary over time. We also have to bear in mind the possibility that 2 songs could share the same melody without ever being connected in print. On a very practical level, and this may sound familiar by now, this raises the difficult question of how we can actually decide whether 2 prints represent the same song. Of course, the question of how much change a text could undergo and still represent the same text is completely open to debate. For now, I have chosen to use just the first and last stanzas in a print as indicators in order to have a more pragmatic solution to this problem. As long as these stanzas are identical apart from changes in typesetting or spelling, I have considered 2 prints to represent the same songs. But of course, this preliminary strategy is not bulletproof, and a more systematic approach might have to be found out in the future. One possibility would be to just use text comparison of transcriptions of texts and define some sort of threshold as to how much difference that could be allowed, and still that the core of the text still remains the same. Identifying to which song a reference on a print belongs is an even bigger challenge, since in many cases we have only an abbreviated title or a first line of a song to work with. Some given titles are far from unambiguous, such as the Song of the Battle in France, for example, which actually never occurs in this form in print, and thus the line could refer to literally any song that sings about a battle that took place in France somewhere. Problems can also occur when only the first line of a song is given as a reference. In some cases, there are many songs which use the same first line, probably even in reference to each other. In hindsight, it is not always possible to determine which one was the earlier one or even the original one, let alone. So in some of these cases, we can take into account line counts or meter of the song and rhyming schemes to disambiguate the references. However, of course, there's a really big factor of uncertainty that comes into play here, especially since we also have to consider the possibility that a song was actually never written down. My first attempts of actually generating and visualizing a contrafactum network are based on a test sample that I have gathered within the larger framework of my PhD project until now. The major online resources Verzeichnis der Drucke des 16. Jahrhunderts and the interconnected platform Verzeichnis der deutschsprachigen Liedflunkdrucke, which specializes on songs, have proven to be good starting points for finding the printed songs. They also provide additional and fairly reliable bibliographic information for each source. Working from there, I have manually narrowed down a selection of around 122 prints by applying the provisional selection criteria listed here. This was mainly done to keep the amount of ambiguous information as low as possible. Since the sample should serve as the basis for my further research on political song pamphlets from Switzerland, I have decided to additionally narrow down the sample according to certain topics. But while this makes complete sense within the framework of my PhD project, we have to consider that there are serious repercussions for our network visualization. The selection process in general favors non-controversial songs, which may already be more likely to have survived and render the sample overall more homogeneous. For each printed object, I have collected information about dates and place of print, as well as the song each print itself manifests and the song it refers to in a simple database. Since the coordination of prints and references to songs can be highly ambiguous, I have stored some comments as to the level of certainty of these references in my database. But for now, I have not been able to include this information somehow in my network. The prints included in my sample differ in the number of references they make. Most prints, 69 in total, refer just to one song. 13 make 2 references, and just a single one makes even 3 references. 39 of them have no reference at all. We may assume that prints that refer to more than one song will not actually have had several different melodies attached to them, but rather just account for maybe differences in knowledge in their audience. Although we cannot entirely rule out the possibility of a song having parallel melodies. Prints that bear no reference at all may be more problematic, since we do not know whether this means that they had their own original melody, or whether the reference was made more implicitly through textual parallels and allusions. We will see in a short while how this affects the network itself. The actual visualization of the network of songs has been done using the software NodeCode, since it is not only relatively accessible for a beginner, but also allows for some intuitive exploration of the data. In this network, each node represents one song, while each edge represents a reference found in a printed object, as described above. Note that the direction of the arrow actually points from the referenced song to the referencing song, so not the other way around. It moves from the potentially earlier song to the newer one, or in the direction of a potential flow of information, if you will. NodeCode's visualization not only influences the distribution of the nodes, but also changes the size of the dots according to the number of edges. It also weighs the edges according to how often a reference appears in print. While the first 2 come in quite handy for exploring our data set at the moment, I would argue that we should largely ignore the weight of the edges for now, as this tells us more about the number of times a song occurs in our sample than anything else. At this point, I should maybe explain why I chose to create a directed graph of the references themselves instead of creating a network of shared references, as is often done when studying citation networks. The problem here lies with the songs for which we can't find a reference to another song in our sample. In order to include them in our network of shared references, we would have to assume that they generally had original melodies and thus sort of auto-reference themselves. If we would just leave them out of our analysis, on the other hand, we might just lose sight of interesting connections. But of course, this decision may complicate analysis, and I'm curious as to your inputs on this matter later on in the discussion section. While the size of the sample may limit the informative value of our network from a quantitative perspective, it allows us to set out exploring the relations in a more intuitive manner to begin with. The first thing that may be striking, although maybe not very surprising, is the fact that the network is separated into many individual clusters that are not connected among themselves. This is of course due to the fact that we are dealing with songs that are not all compatible with each other and thus cannot be connected all at once. If we assume that it was unlikely that one song was sung in two completely different melodies, we can also assume that all songs that are linked together, either directly or through other nodes, are highly likely to have had the same melody. The network thus provides us with an overview of clusters of shared melodies that would not become evident by just tracing back individual references of single songs. The network also lets us observe the role of single nodes within these clusters. The one node that stands out in our sample is the song Wie wohl ich bin ein alter Greis, which we have already encountered in our introduction. Not only does it seem to have been used frequently as a reference, it served also as a basis for songs that then in turn were used as a reference for others. However, it never explicitly refers to any other song itself in our sample period. While again, this may not give us absolute proof that the song is actually at the origin of the melody in this cluster, it lets us infer that it was this song that was most likely associated the closest with the melody in our sample period, and thus probably have influenced people's associations with it the most. It is also interesting to examine how such constellations change over time. The case of Der alte Greis, for example, suggests that the song not only lost its position at the center of the cluster, but also that one of the songs previously associated with it actually developed a life of its own toward the turn of the century. Of course, before inferring anything directly from this changed appearance, we would have to test how the changes in sample size and shape could actually affect the shape of these clusters. Thinking about associations people might have with certain melodies brings us back to the statement I made at the beginning of the presentation, that contrafactum is especially interesting because it can serve as a tool to create allusions to other songs and their textual contents. I think one of the most promising potentials of using a network approach to examining contrafactum lies exactly here. What could be done in the future would be to include keywords of topics the different songs touch upon in our analysis. Of course, we again encountered the same problem that we have heard of just before, that this would have to be done in a systematic way somehow, and we would have to come up with a strategy to do this. The image here should just illustrate what such a network including keywords could look like for the cluster that we have just touched upon before. The topics here have just been manually and provisionally assigned by me. But we can already see that the two keywords, battle and song of praise, which is usually a song of praise of a city or a region, are the two dominant keywords in this cluster. Of course, the distribution of keywords would have to be put in relation to the distribution of keywords in the whole sample if we really wanted to detect tendency, but it may still give an impression of what might be possible moving forward from here. Including these keywords in our analysis would let us determine whether either individual songs or even whole melodies tended to be preferentially associated with certain topics or purposes, as well as maybe also get a glimpse of the repertoire of possible associations that people might have had with a certain song or a melody. I hope that despite the shortcomings of such a small sample, and the lack of hard facts and calculations, my presentation has been able to show some perspectives of what could be done using a network visualization when studying contrafactum relations. However, still a lot remains to be done to get there. On one hand, certain aspects of the data gathering process need to be further formalized. One possibility would be to make serial transcripts of the prints. This would allow me to then in turn compare the text automatically and define quantifiable thresholds for the identification of different prints of the same song. Using such transcriptions might also help formalize the distribution of keywords, maybe even moving more toward topic modeling. On the other hand, the data set will have to be expanded gradually. An expanded data set brings with it both the possibility and the need to move more deeply into the truly quantitative aspects of network analysis, using clustering and centrality measures to describe what we have just been able to see by eye for now. Finally, let us not forget that printed songs can also relate to each other on a purely textual level, as well as through the reuse of the woodcuts that are present on the title pages. Once we have established and refined our contrafactum network, it might be interesting to look into this and take into account the whole spectrum of what has been called the feedback loops of early modern popular print culture in general, and of early modern songs in particular. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sara, for your presentation. I'm sure there must be some questions.
Yes, I have a question on the scope of the songs you included in your sample, and perhaps I missed this. So you mentioned that you did include certain topics and you excluded other topics. Mm-hmm. So what would happen if, one of the topics you excluded? So, for example, some sacred song refers mm-hmm. to a political song. Will you miss this in your sample, or will this be solved in another way?
Well, actually, the song itself would be present in my sample somehow, but not in the sample of prints, but in the sample of songs. I have not mentioned this. I can maybe re-show you the graph if you would like, but I have actually made a distinction between songs of which I have a print, actually, and songs that just occur as melodies, but never in print. So the scope would be just all melodies that somehow occur on a print, either as a manifestation or as a reference, if that clears it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Katharina has a comment.
Yes, I'm just a very specific point of your talk, because you had this problem with manifestations, and is it actually the same text that is printed, or the same song that is printed in several prints? I mean, this is a general problem with early written material, but I wonder whether it would make sense to look into what is called Ferber, the Ferber model for bibliographic references. So that's what the librarians use nowadays for the library catalogs. I'll put the name in the text. It's probably easier.
Yes.
Just for some theoretical discussions. Mm-hmm. But you might have looked in that anyway, because manifestation is a word that comes up there a lot.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions? I had a question, but it's mostly out of curiosity. Like, are there, I don't know if you mentioned, are there examples of the same lyric, but that we could know that they changed the melody, that they took the text and just changed the way of singing it?
I've actually never encountered this example, but I suppose it could be true, because it all depends on the familiarity of the people with a certain song as a reference to a melody. So maybe if that changes, they could also change the melody in the whole. But I've never actually encountered this example.
And there's another question. So, well, I can read it out loud. At least, Kathleen, don't you want to ask the question with your microphone, or I can read it loud otherwise?
Yeah, hi. I was really fascinated by this because I see a lot of contrafactum in the manuscripts I work with, and there's been a lot of ideas about how to study contrafactum. And I was just, this is brilliant, I thought. I was wondering how much work has already been done when you're working with this. Are you kind of starting out from the ground and really just having to do everything yourself, or can you build on other people's work? And then
do you mean contrafactum in general, or specifically for my region and source material?
I'm thinking more of your region and source material, because of course it's a huge topic, and when you want to bring it into a region, sometimes it's very difficult to.
So it's actually my PhD project is part of a larger project that is at sort of trying a first attempt at looking more closely at printed songs in German from a perspective of media and music history in general. So a more interdisciplinary approach. So the songs, they have been studied. There are some bibliographies of them, but actually never with a focus on contrafactum, for example, or the melodic aspects of it. So it's I think there is not much to start working on, actually. But there are, of course, brilliant studies that have been done for England and other countries.
Yeah, so can you put the name in the chat of the project? Because from Iceland, for example, there's a lot of influence coming from the German ballads, almost none from the English. So it would be great to just.
So I'll just try and copy paste the link to the project as a whole.
Okay, super, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. There's another question from Barbara. I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself, Barbara.
Yes, I wanted to ask if you have any instances of a song that is in the male voice having a contrafactum in the female voice, or vice versa. A student of mine has found this in the Trouvère repertory, that this is one way a song comments on another by changing the gender.
Yes. So actually, because the songs that I have looked at are generally, in a way, let's say, more national songs than people talking. It's usually, it's if there are people, they're all men all the way through. So this is not really an issue for the moment, but I could imagine that this might also change over time. I've just been looking at this snippet of songs of this snippet in time for now. So I'm hoping that I might also find such interesting little things that pop up, these relations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we see Marnix has shared a link to a database of Dutch songs, Liederenbank.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for that. And yeah, Sara, if you could then copy the link if you find it at some point, it would be great.
Just working on it now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for the input. Yeah.
We have time for a small question if there's one short question. Okay, then otherwise, well, thanks a lot, Sara, for the presentation and the answers. And we'll have the next presentation in 10 minutes.